Hi dear students, welcome to Kavitha's NEET classes. In this lecture, we shall discuss the location and the structure of the human heart. First, speaking about the location of the human heart. The human heart is located in the thoracic cavity in between the two lungs, and it is slightly tilted towards the left side. Here you can see this is the lungs, right? So, the human heart is located in the thoracic cavity in between the two lungs, and it is slightly tilted towards the left side. And the size of the human heart is that of the clenched fist. Okay. Now, let's discuss the structure of the human heart. The heart is a muscular chambered structure, and it is enclosed by a protective covering called as the pericardium. Okay. The human heart is enclosed in a protective covering called as the pericardium. The pericardium is comprised of outer parietal pericardium and inner visceral pericardium. Okay, the pericardium is a protective layer of the heart. It protects the heart from mechanical injuries, and it also acts as a shock absorbent. The pericardium is comprised of outer parietal pericardium and inner visceral pericardium. Okay. In between the parietal and the visceral pericardium, that is in between these two layers, we have a fluid which is called as the parietal fluid, and it is this parietal fluid which acts as a shock absorber. So overall, the function of the pericardium is to act as a shock absorber and also to protect the heart against mechanical injuries. Now let's look into the different chambers of the heart, which is the atrium and the ventricle. The heart is comprised of four chambers. The upper chamber are called as the atria or atrium. Atria is plural and atrium is singular. Okay. So, upper two chambers are called as atrium and the lower two chambers are called as ventricle. Okay. The upper chamber are slightly or comparatively smaller in size than the lower chambers, which is the ventricle. Also, the wall of the atrium is thin, whereas the wall of the ventricles are thick and muscular. So why is this so? Because the ventricles have to pump blood against gravity. They have a thick wall, whereas the atrium have a thin wall. Okay, so the heart is comprised of four chambers. The upper chambers are relatively smaller in size than the lower chambers. The upper chambers are called as the atrium and the lower chambers are called as the ventricle. The upper chambers have a wall which is thin, whereas the lower chambers have a thick and muscular wall because they have to pump blood against gravity, and that is why the ventricles have a thicker wall. Keep this in mind. Now, the upper two chambers, that is the left atrium and the right atrium, are separated from one another by interatrial septum. That is, a thin muscular wall separates the right atrium from the left atrium. And then this thin wall is called as interatrial septum. It is called as interatrial septum. Okay, a thin wall separates the left atrium from the right atrium, and it is called as the interatrial septum. Whereas a thick muscular wall separates the right ventricle from the left ventricle, and this thick muscular wall is called as the interventricular septum. It is called as interventricular septum. Okay, so the heart is composed of 4 chambers, the upper chambers which are comparatively smaller in size than the lower chambers. The upper chambers are called as the atrium and the lower chambers are called as the ventricle. The two atrium, that is the left atrium and the right atrium, are separated from one another by the interatrial septum, and the two ventricles, that is the left and the right ventricle, are separated from one another through a thick muscular wall which is called as the interventricular septum. Okay, so now we shall discuss about the atrioventricular septum. About the atrioventricular septum. A thick fibrous tissue. A thick fibrous tissue separates the atrium and the ventricle. Okay, a thick fibrous tissue separates the atrium and the ventricle on either side, and it is guarded by valves, which is called as the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve. Okay, so on either side, the atrium and the ventricle are separated by a atrioventricular septum. Okay, there are thick fibrous tissue which separates the right and the right atrium and the right ventricle, and similarly the left atrium and the left ventricle, and it is called as the atrioventricular septum. Atrioventricular septum. Okay, so what is atrioventricular septum? A septum which separates the atrium from the ventricle. It is a thick fibrous tissue which separates the atrium from the ventricle on either side, and this atrioventricular septum is guarded by a valve. Okay, it is guarded by a valve which is comprised of 3 flaps or 3 cusps on the right side. Here you can see this is one cusp, this is one, and there's one more over here. Okay, so on the right side, the atrioventricular septum is guarded by 3 cusps or flaps. Hence, it is called as tricuspid valve. It is called as tricuspid valve. And on the left side, you can see that the atrioventricular septum is guarded by 2 flaps or cusps. Hence, it is called as bicuspid valve. Here you can see there are 2 flaps or cusps. It is called as bicuspid valve, or it is also called as the mitral valve. Okay, so did you all understand bicuspid and tricuspid valve so far? The atrium and the ventricle are separated by a thick fibrous tissue which is called as the atrioventricular septum on either side, and this septum is guarded by the tricuspid valve on the right side and the bicuspid or the mitral valve on the left side. Now moving on to the chordae tendineae and papillary muscles. Here you can see that there are white fibrous cords, white fibrous thick cords which are attached to the flaps or the cusps of the bicuspid or the tricuspid valve on one end, and it is attached to thick muscular structures over here. This muscular structure is called as the papillary muscle, and this white colored, here you can see these fibrous cord-like structures are called as the chordae tendineae. Okay, did you understand what is chordae tendineae and what is papillary muscles? Chordae tendineae are fibrous cords which are attached to the cusps of the tricuspid valve or the bicuspid valve on one end, and on the other end they are attached to thick muscular structures called as the papillary muscles. Okay, so chordae tendineae are attached to the cusps or the flaps of the bicuspid or the tricuspid valve on one end, and on the other end they are attached to thick muscular structures called as the papillary muscles. So here this is chordae tendineae, okay, and this is papillary muscles. I hope you can see it. Okay, so the fibrous cord-like structures which attach on one end to the bicuspid or the tricuspid valve, and on the other end they attach to these muscular structures called as papillary muscles. So this is called as chordate tendineae and this is called as papillary muscle. What is the function of the chordate tendineae? So the chordate tendineae is the one which holds the bicuspid and the tricuspid valve so that they do not collapse back into the atrium during strong ventricular contractions. Okay, it is the chordate tendineae along with the papillary muscles which holds back the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve so that they do not collapse back into the atrium during strong ventricular contractions, and that is the function of the chordate tendineae. Fine. So now we shall discuss about the semilunar valves. Here you can see the pulmonary artery and this is the aorta. So the endings of or the openings of the pulmonary artery and the aorta in the heart are guarded by semilunar valves or half moon shaped valves. Okay. Here you can see from the right ventricle, deoxygenated blood is pumped into the pulmonary artery, isn't it? Similarly, from the left ventricle, oxygenated blood is pumped into the aorta. After the ventricular contraction, when the blood enters into the respective, that is pulmonary artery and the aorta respectively, then when the ventricles relax, there is a possibility that the blood which has entered into these will return back into the ventricles. So in order to prevent that, these pulmonary artery and the aorta are guarded by these semilunar valves. Semilunar means half moon shaped. So here you can see semilunar valves which are guarding the pulmonary artery and the aorta. Okay, these are the openings of the pulmonary artery and the aorta in the heart, and these openings are guarded by semilunar valve so that after the blood enters into the pulmonary artery and the aorta respectively, during ventricular contraction, it prevents the backflow of the blood into the ventricles. Got it? Suppose if these were not there, then during ventricular relaxation, there's a possibility of the blood flowing back into the ventricles, isn't it? So the backflow of the blood from the pulmonary artery and the aorta is prevented by these semilunar valves which guard the openings of the pulmonary artery and the aorta in the heart. Okay, so the right atrium, the right ventricle and the pulmonary artery deal with the deoxygenated blood. You can see that deoxygenated blood from the superior vena cava, from the inferior vena cava and from the coronary sinus. What is coronary sinus? We shall be discussing this in our next lecture. Okay, as of now, you just understand that deoxygenated blood from the superior vena cava, from the inferior vena cava and the coronary sinuses enter into the right atrium, and from the right atrium they enter into the right ventricle from where they are pumped into the pulmonary artery. So from the pulmonary artery it moves to the lungs for oxygenation, isn't it? On the left side, that is the left atrium, the left ventricle and the aorta, they deal with the oxygenated blood. So here you can see from the pulmonary veins, oxygenated blood enters into the left atrium, and from the left atrium it moves into the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle the oxygenated blood is pumped into the aorta, which is the largest artery, isn't it? Which is the largest artery in the human body. So oxygenated blood is pumped into the aorta, which circulates the blood to different organs and tissues of the body. So the left atrium, left ventricle and the aorta deal with the oxygenated blood. So further, much more in depth about the conducting system of the heart, the oxygenation, the deoxygenation of the blood, all of this we shall be discussing in a subsequent lectures. So if you have any doubts or queries, you can share with me in the comment section below. The human heart, the structure, location, the conducting system, the rhythmic contractions, that is the systole, diastole, all of these are very, very important as per our NEET examination. And so I will be making a series of lectures on each of these topics, and most importantly, we will also be discussing the previous year questions and what kind of questions can we expect from these topics. So stay tuned and subscribe to the channel. And if you have any queries, you can write it in the comment section below. Thank you.